Hello and welcome back to the Ideal Nutrition podcast. My name is Torwen Eerkens and I'm here today with my co-host Aidan Muir. Today we're going to be talking about the Mediterranean diet and whether we think it's the gold standard for health.
So defining the Mediterranean diet, it is a nutritional pattern modelled after the traditional eating habits of people living in countries bordering the Mediterranean Sea, specifically Greece, Italy and Spain, during the mid-20th century. And obviously that timing is pretty key in terms of like before a large increase in certain food availability and stuff like that. It is also characterized specifically by high consumption of plant-based foods, healthy fats, moderate consumption of protein, with an above average emphasis on fish and plant-based sources and lower intakes of certain things like red meats as well. Very low consumption of processed foods in general. And it also can include some lifestyle factors such as like social interaction during meals being a consistent factor too.
Now there's an array of benefits that has been associated with the Mediterranean diet pattern, including a high intake of fibre, healthy fats, plant-based foods, as well as just generally a lot of minimally processed foods, which promotes an anti-inflammatory style diet. Now it does have proposed benefits for some specific conditions, which we will run through today as well. So should we start with cardiovascular disease?
Absolutely. That's the most well-documented one. So it's just a clear benefit of the Mediterranean diet. All the research kind of supports this. The first review I found, once again, prepping for this podcast, was just one that was like designed to critically analyze the research. Like it was a critical review, and it was kind of like positioned as like, have we all been misled? Has the data been wrong? Like, because a few people have like found flaws in some of the more well-known studies on it. And even that review that was like trying to find this and address controversies just concluded the available evidence is large, strong, and consistent. Better conformity with the traditional Mediterranean diet is associated with better cardiovascular health outcomes, including clinically meaningful reductions in a long list of these things.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's the same review, but it looked at over 40 studies, potentially a different one, consistently 10 to 30% lower cardiovascular disease risk, especially with that high adherence. And that's something that does come back, and we will talk about in terms of adherence, but it seems to be the closer you adhere to this diet, the better the outcomes are.
Now, a nuanced one here is cholesterol. So I have read a lot of studies myself where I've seen that the Mediterranean diet didn't really change people's cholesterol, assuming they were weight neutral during the study, even though there was a massive improvement in dietary quality. I have sat through a lot of like professional development kind of seminars from people who are very experienced exclusively studying the Mediterranean diet or largely exclusively studying that. And it seems like a common theme that I've heard a lot of people say that like the Mediterranean diet doesn't necessarily improve this. I've had a fresh look at the research again, and my current stance is I'd say on average people do get a small improvement in cholesterol levels when switching to a Mediterranean diet, but not all studies show this. But one thing that is super clear is it actually just does not seem to matter because it improves cardiovascular disease outcomes regardless. And the main reason we care about cholesterol is for this outcome.
Absolutely. Anything else you wanted to add in terms of cholesterol, or should we chat about weight in general?
Yeah, let's talk about weight.
Yeah. So this diet, it's interesting. It's not necessarily used to support weight loss. Research does show it's not necessarily better than other diets such as lower carb diets, but generally the fact that it has high fiber foods, high volume, less processed foods likely does promote a healthy weight generally, which we do find in a lot of these populations as well. But it's important to note that there is also a very high fat intake, which can lead to a high intake of energy-dense foods. Yeah.
And I would say it's definitely something that is, although it's not specifically a weight loss diet, I think what wording did you use just before in terms of like people falling into a healthy weight if they follow it for a long period of time?
Yeah.
Is definitely something that dramatically reduces the risk of people gaining a significant amount of weight over time. I have looked at a lot of studies looking at ad libitum intakes of the Mediterranean diet, so just people eating until they feel comfortably full. And a lot of those do result in weight maintenance, even if dietary quality is massively improved. I do want to take a step back though and stop looking at the Mediterranean diet for a second and just go like more big picture nutrition stuff. This is just largely because weight loss requires a calorie deficit. If you do almost anything ad libitum, like there are cases that it will result in weight loss, right? But there are some reasons why it won't in all cases or in a lot of cases. And that's that if you go into a deficit, other things often change. Typically your appetite will increase, typically energy expenditure will decrease over time. And some of these things can just lead to people just naturally just maintaining over time, even with big improvements in dietary quality. There are many cases where people like stop drinking alcohol and like they expected weight to just fall off and then it doesn't happen, but did their calorie intake increase elsewhere because of these same variables? And ways around that, I would often say, is just having some form of structure in place whether it's around portion sizes or whatever. So doing a lot of things ad libitum might not lead to the results you would fully expect, but that's my own 2 cents as to why we could sometimes see this in addition to the high fat content as well of the Mediterranean diet.
In terms of proposed mechanisms of why the Mediterranean diet can support these things that we've just spoken about, generally, I think the cardioprotective nature, as well as any of those anti-inflammatory effects, are very likely due to the high consumption of bioactive compounds, things like polyphenols in the plant-based food, as well as specifically extra virgin olive oil, which is then believed to have an anti-inflammatory effect.
Yeah, and it's super high in monounsaturated fats as well, which could play a role in a bunch of things too. And this diet's also high in omega-3s as well because of the higher than average emphasis on fish intake. So the combo of a bunch of that can lead to a bunch of benefits, including reducing the risk of atherosclerosis building up, which is something that's playing a big role. We also see such a low intake of processed foods, which is going to potentially be playing a role as well. Like if we go back to that concept of like staying leaner on average, it's a lot harder to overconsume foods if you have less access to really tasty, really easily accessible food that's like almost designed to encourage to overeat as well.
There are a few downsides as well. Should we go through those too?
Sure thing. Where do you want to start?
Let's chat about athletes, and specifically I want to talk about lower protein and the fact that it potentially, in terms of energy requirements, it can be harder to meet through diets like the Mediterranean diet. So it's important to consider that it can be lower in protein, especially we're reducing red meat portions generally. Yes, it contains some fish and poultry in moderation as well, but generally the diet pattern doesn't support super high intakes of protein. So people like athletes who do have high protein requirements, sometimes this diet may not be optimal to support that, in the same way that athletes or anyone else with higher energy requirements, it can be hard to meet their energy requirements due to eating mostly minimal, whole, unprocessed foods.
Yeah, because even in the ad libitum studies, like they often talk about it in ratios or frequency per week. Like they might have something like a handful of nuts per day or whatever. And even if you were going like ad libitum, maybe you might have 45 grams instead of 30 or whatever, but it's like ideally the overall ratio of your food across the days and weeks comes out the same. So like with the lower emphasis on red meat and stuff like that, that still applies. So yeah, I would also agree that if I was working with anyone who is an athlete and there is any benefit from them having a little bit more muscle mass, I'd typically go higher protein. I have one that I personally think is interesting. So I'm going to talk about one of the practicalities because there's a few, but the one I'm going to talk about is cost. And this is something that I just find interesting. So in 2017, there was a study called the SMILES trial come out. I've spoken about heaps on the podcast. It was related to nutrition for depression, but it was specifically a modified Mediterranean diet. There was a bit of a combination of the Australian Dietary Guidelines and a Mediterranean diet. But they did a separate study, once again, this is in the show notes as well, but they did a separate study that was looking at what it would cost to do this diet, but then also looking at what the participants of this study, what they were already spending on foods. This study was in 2017, so there's inflation, but I've done the work. I've actually done inflation adjustment for this as well. So before inflation, they calculated that participants on average were spending $138 per week on food and beverages for personal consumption at the baseline, whereas the cost per person per week for the diet that they were recommending, which is this modified Mediterranean diet, was coming out as $112 per week, with both of these estimates based on mid-range product costs. So they basically just did like a food diary and stuff like that before. I did fact check this, and they did include the cost of things like alcohol and eating out in the people's original kind of thing, whereas obviously on the diet, they're not encouraged to be doing as much as those things. The inflation adjusted figures is $142 for the Mediterranean diet and $175 for what they were doing. The reason why I also find this interesting, and I've told to Torwen of this like last round of podcasting we did, I used to work in a job where I was working with a lot of people who had depression, so I was talking about this study a fair bit. And I remember I was like mentioning these numbers to them and saying how like the cost of the Mediterranean diet was actually coming out a tiny bit lower than what people were naturally spending. And it didn't resonate with anyone. Like everyone was like, $112 per week for food for one person is insane. And I do think the average person does spend more than they would probably think once you factor in eating out and stuff like that. But the other angle I will absolutely take on this is a Mediterranean diet is not cheap. Mediterranean diet's not cheap. And we're probably still going to eat out anyway. Like, it's probably not going to change that as well.
And I wanted to add something in there because that's a very practical recommendation. Another one is just the time it takes to cook from scratch. So a lot of these ingredients in the Mediterranean diet are whole foods, so you need to cook them to make a complete meal. That can take a lot of time, planning, and like you say, cost as well.
And how I was saying how I've been to a lot of PDs from people who have done the research on this. One little cheat code that they do in some of these studies, and in that Smiles trial in particular, they give people a food hamper where like a lot of stuff's already a bit like pre-done. They've given them, and like that gives the people time to adjust and also have a bit of practice cooking the stuff that it's like a bit of the work's already been done for them. But the people who I've heard talk about this have said that they have almost always underestimated how hard it would be for people to like just go from not being on a Mediterranean diet to being on one. And the specific thing they've said is most people need to completely change their cooking and learn completely different ways of cooking that they have not previously been doing. And I know you can get around that in many ways, but it is just food for thought. Like if where I'm coming from when I say that is we've just gone through a bunch of benefits of the Mediterranean diet. The next question you could ask is, why don't you just recommend that for everybody? And this is one of my explanations behind that as well, in addition to the protein too.
So then the question is, do we feel like you need to stick to it 100%, or can there be adaptations made to the diet? I generally think sticking to it 100% for most people is not completely feasible. Taking aspects of the Mediterranean diet though and copying that food pattern is probably more where my thoughts lie. But I'm keen to hear what you have to say, Aidan.
So in many cases, I don't like things that are just arbitrary in a way. And I think this is kind of an example of this where I mentioned earlier how it's like in the mid 20th century, and that's like directly like post World War II. And the access to food that people had directly post World War II in those countries was different to what we have now, right? And some of the things are a bit arbitrary based on that. In many cases, it actually lines up pretty well, but it is food for thought that, like, for example, one of the reasons why it's low in certain meat and also it's low in dairy as well is access was just lower. It's low in ultra-processed foods because they didn't have access. The olive oil thing is interesting because at the time they didn't have access to mass-produced other forms of oil, whereas they did have access to a lot of olive oil. But that's probably, like a lot of things I've said, like you're probably like, oh, it's not that big of a deal, right? But I will come back to the olive oil one specifically. So the traditional Mediterranean diet, or it includes 40 to 60 mil of olive oil per day. And we know that because people are getting really good outcomes, instead of dismissing that, I would be like, okay, I think there's something to that. I think there are some benefits associated with that. But if we're going back to like, what do we recommend for people, say, in Australia or other countries like that? I'm probably never recommending that to anybody. I think two things can be true. I think extra virgin olive oil is really great from a health perspective. I recommend it to a lot of people. I don't think we should be having around 500 calories from it when we also do have access to other foods that they were not consuming in the traditional Mediterranean diet. And I think if most people went down that route, they'd probably end up over-consuming calories just in general, which could lead to other health complications too. Especially
with a background of potentially already higher discretionary food intake. That makes a lot of sense. I think on that sense too, I think there are factors, when I said there was factors that I support, a high fibre intake, a high intake of plant-based foods makes a lot of sense, making sure that majority or at least some of your meals are unprocessed foods. Fatty fish is a really interesting one, and if you're unable to consume fish in your diet, supplementing with something like an omega-3 or a fish oil would be my suggestions there.
And I only had one other downside. I don't know if you've got any more, but alcohol is the only other one I've got. I don't want to go on this one too long because I put this down in writing before the podcast. And I was like, geez, that sounds way more savage than how I speak, but it is what it is. The standard Mediterranean diet contains up to one standard drink per day for women and 2 for men, often consumed alongside meals is how it's done. There was once a time where some people, not everybody, but some people were interpreting research as though a little bit of alcohol is better for cardiovascular disease outcomes than not drinking at all. And I also think the Mediterranean diet kind of like perpetuated that a little bit as well. But that's absolutely not what the research supports in 2026. From a health perspective, the less alcohol, the better. So if optimizing for health, that's something I would drop. And the bit where it's like more savage is like, I don't know, I'm never really out there being like, you need to stop drinking alcohol completely or whatever. But if I'm just looking at it objectively, like the less alcohol, the better. So that's kind of the stance I've got.
Amazing. We'll wrap up there then. This has been episode 250 of the Ideal Nutrition Podcast. Thank you for listening along. And as always, if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a positive review. Thank you.